Everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the history of forensic psychology as our first lecture of the semester. Now, in terms of the history of forensic psychology, and here you'll hear me use the term forensic psychology and psychology and law interchangeably, because in essence they really do relate to the same issue here that we're going to be talking about. So when I discuss this issue of forensic psychology, we really are trying to tackle this issue of psychology in the legal system, if you would like. So in terms of the history of forensic psychology, we see that the history of forensic psychology is a very rich history. We actually see that in terms of American psychology, we actually see that at the turn of the 20th century, there really wasn't very much interest in terms of applying research topics in psychology to the ideas of the legal system. But even though we didn't have that much interest at the turn of the 20th century, we definitely did still have some interest coming from some psychological researchers such as James McKeen Cattell and also William Stern, who essentially were looking at reliability associated with witness testimonies, and Stern was looking at the aspects associated with emotions associated with witness recall. Now, even though they weren't directly working with the legal system or with individuals within the law, we still had an interest coming from some individuals within the field of psychology, but yet not as much as what it is that we currently see in present day. Now, as you notice, the topics that both Cattell and Stern did investigate are still topics that are hotly debated and hotly researched within the field of cognitive psychology and also forensic psychology in our present time. Now, throughout the early 1900s, we started seeing that the legal systems or the court systems started now including a little bit more work associated with what psychologists were doing in terms of the research field and trying to include them now within the field of law. And Hugo Munsterberg was a great individual who really was the pioneer for this whole push for the idea of including psychology into the legal system. Hugo Munsterberg is actually known as the father of forensic psychology. And what he was most interested in was really trying to allow the legal system to understand how many psychological factors might potentially affect how a trial's outcome might potentially be influenced. So issues associated with false confession, the power of suggestion, issues associated with the cross-examinations and also using physiological measures that would later then be used to create such things as our polygraphs, were very important to Hugo Munsterberg and essentially was really kind of this pioneer in terms of making the big push for the inclusion of both fields to come joined together. Now, we do also see that there's a lot of other history or historical issues or historical components associated with the field of forensic psychology. Clark and Clark were two very famous researchers who, during Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which is a very famous case in the history of segregation of individuals within educational settings and ultimately leading to the desegregation aspect. So the inclusion of all ethnicities within educational settings. Clark and Clark looked at the psychological effects of segregation on African American children and very interestingly did a study which examined children, both white and black children, looking at a doll and playing with the doll and then seeing how it is that they treated the doll and how they believed that the doll would feel in terms of representation of their own attitudes and their own feelings. Now, we also see that the first use of psychologists in the United States in terms of correctional settings were recorded actually in 1931 back in New York in a women's reformatory, which the main job of the psychologist was actually to determine if the individuals who they were evaluating were what they called feeble-minded at that time. And essentially what that meant was, were they below IQ scores that we would now in present day discuss as being mentally handicapped in our present day discussions. Now, we do also see that there are, again, like I say, many historical issues associated with the field of forensic psychology in terms of the use of psychological assessments for law enforcement screenings. Back in 1916 and 1917, we did see the inclusion of these psychological assessments. We still in present day use psychological assessments not only for law enforcement, but even for the military, even for employment applications or employment opportunities. we definitely do see that the inclusion of mental tests are actually quite largely used. But within law enforcement, it was really in the early part of the 1900s. In 1922, Carl Marby was the first psychologist to ever testify in a civil suit or in a civil trial, where he offered testimony on the psychological issues of reaction times in a train accident case. And ultimately, he found, or he determined, that the train's engineer was actually who was being accused of drinking alcohol prior to the accident. He actually determined that the reaction time that he demonstrated was actually appropriate for the reaction time of a train conductor who was not under the influence of alcohol. Now, in terms of applying forensic psychology and what the purpose of forensic psychology really is, and this interaction between psychology and the legal system, the idea of forensic psychology is really that we're going to have an application of methods, theories, and concepts of psychology, but now applying them to the legal system. Now, even though we're bringing in theories and concepts of psychology to bring into the legal system, this doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to now be contradicting theories associated with criminal justice or with law as a whole, but rather now we're just trying to provide a different perspective for how it is that we can potentially interpret and examine issues associated with behavior, but now from a psychological point of view. And that's very important for us in terms of the discussions as we go on through the semester, that the purposes of this course and the idea of forensic psychology or psychology and law is to really see how the two fields really interact together to create what it is that we actually see in terms of the field of forensic psychology and also our interpretation of behavior that occurs not only from criminals, but also from all individuals within the legal system. Let that be police officers, the victims, jurors, expert witnesses, lawyers, judges, defendants, guards, parole officers, everything that we actually examine within the legal system, anything that displays a human behavior, in this particular case, going all the way from a witness to police officers to judges, is going to be very, very important for us to be able to examine. Now, since forensic psychology is a very important aspect associated with this whole idea of police officer and parole officers in terms of legal system or even prison guards and prisoners, one of the readings that we're going to be doing for this semester is Philip Zimbardo's The Lucifer Effect, Why Good People Do Bad Things, is going to be a very important book that we're going to be using this semester to really discuss some of the aspects as to why individuals may behave in specific fashions, especially whenever it is that you look at individuals within the correctional systems part of the model of the legal system. So let those be the police officers, the prison guards, or even parole officers, and then also looking at the prisoner behavior as well that we're going to be discussing this semester. Now, a major question that we tend to get as instructors of forensic psychology is the following. Who employs a forensic psychologist? Or, for instance, if I was going to be a forensic psychologist, where could I possibly work? And that's actually a very good question. To be honest, you can actually work as a forensic psychologist in a variety of different settings. Let this be from the federal setting to state or local governments, or even local facilities or government facilities or state facilities. These can be in terms of prisons, jails, police departments, correctional facilities, in terms of probation offices or even parole offices. Like I also mentioned, one of the aspects associated with what forensic psychology now tends to do quite a bit is assessment of individuals, not only from a legal standpoint, but also from a military standpoint. So forensic psychologists can also work within the military or within various different aspects associated with all three of the federal, state, and local levels of our government. Now, forensic psychologists can also, in some instances, work at treatment facilities, let those be rehabilitation centers for drug or chemical abuses, residential facilities where they're going to be providing some type of counseling to individuals, mental hospitals, or other types of treatment facilities that individuals might be seeking some type of assistance in terms of correcting some aspect associated with their behavior. And as you can see, some of the behaviors in terms of the drug or the chemical abuse or dependency rehabilitation centers, those may be sometimes legal or illegal drugs as well. So it's not necessarily just for the aspect of criminal behavior that we're interested in, but also making sure that we can deter or rectify some of the aspects associated with individuals who may potentially be led down a path that might potentially be interpreted as being criminal in the future. Court settings also tend to hire individuals who come from a forensic psychology background or who have knowledge associated with both the fields of criminal justice and psychology. Attorneys, legal advocacy groups may also employ individuals who are forensic psychologists. We also have groups of forensic psychologists who are self-employed and go into private practice, or they're consultants, or they become teachers at universities or colleges that they could teach both in psychology and or criminal justice in some particular cases. Now, within forensic psychology, we do find that there's quite a bit of subfields that individuals can specialize within forensic psychology. So just as with what we find within psychology as a whole, or even within criminal justice, that there's subfields that you can really tend to focus in on. So for instance, within criminal justice, you may want to focus in on the corrections aspect, or the police aspect, or the federal aspect, or the local government aspect associated with criminal justice or with the legal system. And as with psychologists, we can also go into different subfields. We can go into clinical psychology or clinical forensic psychology or developmental psychology, social psychology, cognitive psychology, and even criminal investigative psychology are different areas or sub-areas of forensic psychology that individuals can become specialized in and really tend to focus in on more of that aspect of the behavioral components associated with behavior in this particular, or the behavioral aspects associated with criminal behavior in these particular components. So, for instance, a clinical forensic psychologist might potentially be involved in such aspects associated with jury selection. They may also be consulters with lawyers or with court settings. They may be an expert witness that may be called into the court. They are also going to be able to do assessments of competency, insanity, custody assessments that also may be of interest to the court or to a specific group of individuals who may be evaluating an individual who may be going through the legal process. They may also be involved in research or even just be a part of law enforcement screening. So in terms of finding the appropriate law enforcement individuals, again, at local government or even federal levels, providing them with certain types of assessments in terms of psychological components. Now, in terms of consulting with lawyers, this is always a big thing that a lot of individuals are interested in within the field of forensic psychology. A lot of individuals want to do the consulting aspect with lawyers, but don't really understand what it is that they're going to be doing while they consult with lawyers. With one of the things that we do find with forensic psychologists that work with lawyers is that they can really go into two major areas that they may work in with lawyers. One of those areas being the witness preparation, and the other one being the convincing, the aspects associated with the jury. So in terms of witness preparation, consultants who are forensic psychologists in their nature may potentially help witnesses present testimonies, help them with the way that they're going to present emotions while they're giving their testimony, the language that they should be using, the method by which they respond during the testimony, or focusing on key aspects, or even helping them really kind of discuss what it is that they experienced during the traumatic event, if they're the victim or the witness, or whatever it is that their role is within the court setting at that time. The second role of what a forensic psychologist may do in terms of consulting with the lawyer is, again, the aspect of convincing the jury. So since lawyers do prepare opening statements and closing statements for the court setting, forensic psychologists may help the lawyers be able to really help, again, pinpointing specific aspects associated with what it is that they're going to be doing or they did during the actual trial itself. So again, playing on the emotional aspect, or playing on the role of the defendant or the perpetrator, whatever the case may be in this particular case. So we definitely do have to see what their purpose is in terms of that, or even helping the attorney in terms of how to present their case, or even discuss issues associated with evidence to the jurors, because again, do understand that jurors are lay people who come from our community, so they may not necessarily be knowledgeable in all areas and understand exactly what may be being presented during the court setting. So here, by working with the lawyer and helping them be able to transmit the information for memory and comprehension reasons for the jurors, may also be a specific role that may help the lawyers in terms of attaining their goal of winning their trial at that point. Now, forensic psychologists are also going to be involved in some instances with jury selection for the courts or with specific lawyers. So, again, helping the lawyers out in these particular cases. So, in terms of being a jury selection consultant, psychologists might potentially or will potentially use empirically based procedures to select jurors. So, in other words, trying to create a focus group that may give them an idea as to who it is that they want to be able to select as a juror, maybe creating shadow juries, so kind of like a mock jury, so that way they can try to select the individuals that would fit the parameters of what they're interested in. Even looking at prospective jurors and rating them in terms of what it is that they feel might be appropriate for the lawyer, again, who is going to be presenting their case in this particular instance. So here it's very important for us to be able to understand the role of the jury and also understand the role of the jury from a community standpoint. So you may even get a forensic psychologist whose job is to go out into the community and try to understand what the biases are, the perspectives are associated with the community. So do the cultural aspects potentially influence the decisions that are going to be made by the jurors, or are people in this community a little bit more unbiased? Are they more objective in terms of the decision making? Or what are some of the cultural or ethnic aspects that are associated with the community that might influence a jury's decision in terms of making a selection of a verdict or not. Now, we also do have forensic psychologists who go in and act as expert witnesses during court settings. And here, what we would expect from an individual who is going to be an expert witness, we're going to assume that they are going to be an individual who, like we say, is an expert within their field. We are going to have individuals who are not going to go outside of their field of knowledge to be able to give expert advice in this particular case. So what we're looking for here with these individuals who are an expert witness is that they should have a high degree of knowledge associated with the topic that they're going to be discussing. And they're going to be able, again, to transmit as much information to the jury and to the judge as they possibly can associated with the questions that are being asked to them by different lawyers taking on different roles during the court proceedings. So here, an expert might potentially be asked to testify by the court or by the counsel for either the defendant or for the plaintiff, whatever the case may be. Judges may decide if an expert witness can actually claim the expert status or not. So the judge at the end of the day is really the person who then decides, is this person really an expert or not? And like I was mentioning, part of what you want to do as a forensic psychologist or an expert witness is actually be an expert within that field. So for instance, with myself, that I do a lot of work in language research, I do a lot of bilingualism research associated with memory and comprehension and language production and language acquisition. If I got asked to testify as an expert witness regarding criminal insanity, that's something that's way outside of my field of knowledge, and I would never be comfortable doing that because even though I am a psychologist, that is not my area of expertise. So here we would hope that the individuals that we are selecting as experts are actually or truly experts within their field. Now, other areas that psychologists might testify potentially as expert witnesses may potentially be associated with mental health aspects. So, trying to commit an individual to a mental health hospital if that's a possibility or not. Child custody issues, treatment programs that an offender may have to go and complete based on substance abuse or drug abuse or whatever the case may be. They may also be an expert witness in terms of release from involuntary confinement. So here on parole boards, jury selections for criminal profiling, like we say, advice to attorneys regarding factors that will affect the juror's behavior, the juror's decision, and a lot of different other areas in where we can actually see that an expert witness might potentially be called upon to help out during the court proceedings. Now, during a criminal court case, one of the things that we definitely do want to observe is that during the criminal court setting, again, a forensic psychologist, their purpose might go in or be to actually evaluate juveniles accused of criminal acts, the probability that they might be acting upon their criminal behaviors again in the future. potentially used again for the probation aspect or for the parole aspect in terms of evaluating juvenile behavior, the competency and diminished capacity evaluations also of individuals, again, kind of going back to the issues that we talked about at the beginning with some of our researchers, looking at the idea of an individual potentially being of sound mind and also having the intellectual capacity to be to actually have a hearing or to actually have a trial or to stand trial in those particular cases. So here it's very important for forensic psychologists to be involved in all aspects when it comes down to the aspect of the behavioral component with an individual who's being accused of a crime, or even with victims or with witnesses that are being evaluated during court proceedings. Now, much research can actually be done within the field of forensic psychology. And some of the key areas where research is really tending to focus in on at our current state is within the issues of evaluating juries and juries' decision-making skills and also the personality traits associated with jurors. So we look at aspects associated with authoritarianism, locus of control, the ideas of a just world belief. We even look at demographic aspects or demographic differences between jurors, so male versus female demographic differences in terms of their decision-making skills, or even the socioeconomic status of the jurors and how it is that they may make decisions in terms of if an individual is guilty or not guilty, or even their historical or their history, the historical component associated with a juror that might potentially influence their decision of an individual. Now, the other area of research that we tend to see a lot of work in within forensic psychology is the aspect of eyewitness testimony. So looking at issues associated with weapons focus, how stress may impact recollections of information, the emotionality of content that's being presented to the individual, or that may potentially create distortions in memory retrieval or even memory storage, the aspects of overestimating or even underestimating aspects associated with events that may have actually occurred during a criminal act. So potentially, how loud the gunshot was, or the distance between where the person holding the weapon and the hostages were being held, or different aspects associated with the criminal behavior are definitely of interest to forensic psychologists. And a lot of forensic psychologists do come from the field of cognitive psychology who tend to focus in on some of these particular issues. Now, as forensic psychologists, like we say, forensic psychologists can work at the federal level, at the state level, and also at the local level. And just so as you can see how it is that forensic psychologists may actually tie into the aspects of local police departments, forensic psychologists can actually come in and do survey assessments with psychologists, not just for the selection of the individual to see if they're capable enough or not to be able to do the job that's being asked of them, but also how is it that they're actually spending their time in terms of counseling. What kind of counseling practices are they going through? How are they being selected or screened in terms of the personnel that's being given the obligation or the authority to be a police officer within our local communities, and also how it is that we can implement some aspects associated with training and organizational development to help them improve within their own organizations to become better law enforcement officials. So we can see that there are a couple of different ways that forensic psychologists can actually work with local law enforcement officials as well. Now, in terms of, for instance, evaluation of police candidates, that's always a big question that we tend to get as to how is a police officer evaluated? How do they make a decision as to who's going to be a good police officer? Aside from just the aspects of them going to an academy and passing the rigors associated with a police academy and passing criminal justice tests that are given to them in terms of laws and basic knowledge that needs to be acquired associated with the legal system and legal proceedings that occur whenever it is that an individual is arrested or questioned during a criminal or post-criminal events. Forensic psychologists can actually go in and talk with police candidates and do personal interviews to actually see if a law enforcement candidate is displaying any type of psychological distress, or they may potentially have a personality they may not fit well with the police station or with the police location that they are applying to work with. Or for instance, they have some aspects associated with behavior that are just inconsistent with what a typical police officer should do in terms of their behavior. And for instance, in more recent times, we've seen quite a bit of this issue kind of arising with some of the behaviors that are actually displayed by police officers that have been actually caught on recordings, displaying brute force or displaying other types of behaviors that are inappropriate whenever it is that they're making an arrest or they're questioning an individual or making a decision to potentially shoot a suspect or not shoot a suspect as well. So these are very important issues that do tend to arise that we are quite interested in. Now, in terms of other facilities that forensic psychologists might get involved in, since forensic psychologists can definitely work in a variety of different areas, one of those areas being the aspect of a correctional facility. Since forensic psychologists can work not just, again, like we say, at the federal, state, or local level with law enforcement, but also with correctional facilities, it's very important for a forensic psychologist not only to work with the law enforcement officials or the individuals within the legal system, such as probation officers or parole officers, but also working with inmates, working with individuals who are out on probation, working with individuals who are out as a parolee, making sure that they're adapting well to society, that they are moving forward into being and integrating themselves into being a better member of society and no longer leading down that path of crime that we do generally see in terms of those behaviors with individuals who are within correctional facilities. So here what we want is we want to have an individual to be able to be there and not only say, well, what kind of behaviors are you displaying, but rather, what is the probability that your behavior might potentially be displayed in the future? How do we fix that behavior? And how do we help you become a better member of society in terms of adapting yourself better and also not going back to a life of crime or potentially going back to a life of crime? And again, forensic psychologists might administer forensic or psychological assessments, interpret the results associated with those assessments, prepare comprehensive results for parole officers or for probation officers or for whatever the purpose is that they may need to create these types of psychological assessment results. But here, looking at a variety of issues associated with personality, using such things as the MMPI, looking at assessments with a possibility or the likelihood of them committing suicide or again committing lethal behaviors in the future or doing lethal acts that might potentially be hazardous to themselves or to others, or even also cognitive assessments, looking at aspects associated with language production, memory, comprehension, the basic aspects associated with cognition that are going to be important for us to understand why it is that they're displaying such behaviors already out in society or potentially within the correctional facility as well. So other things that we also see forensic psychologists doing, especially the clinical forensic psychologists, is they may help in the development, in the organization, and the administering of individual or even group therapies for individuals who are, again, are inmates who are out on probation or even who are out on parole, and making sure that we provide them with the adequate social support groups and social networks to be able to no longer have to resort back to leading to a life of crime, but rather now they are able to function well and integrate themselves back into society. So in terms of inmate assessment, when is it that we generally tend to assess an individual? If you're talking about an individual who's been paroled or an individual who's out on probation, those individuals, of course, are going to be assessed prior to them being paroled or given the ability to be paroled or who are out on probation, but also during the time while they are on probation and also while they are out on parole. But for an inmate, inmates are generally going to be assessed psychologically for the first time whenever it is that they enter the correctional system. Hopefully what we would want is we would want the individual who's on trial before they actually become an inmate, the person who's being accused of the crime, to actually be given psychological assessments beforehand because of court mandates, But if that doesn't necessarily happen, they may be given psychological assessments once it is they go to the facility itself, that correctional facility, let that be the jail or the prison, whatever it is that we're discussing at that point. But we would also hope that even if they've been given psychological assessments during court proceedings or prior to court proceedings, we would again do it prior to them going in to the facility itself. And again, let that be the jail, the prison, or even a treatment facility that an individual might be going into. And one of the reasons that we want to be able to do that is because now all of a sudden we have a different adaptation, a different situation that's going to be asking them to adapt to. And again, the book that we're going to be reading this semester in terms of the book by Philip Zimbardo, The Lucifer Effect, he discusses the issue of the Stanford prison experiment and how individuals took upon these roles of being inmates or guards and how it is that they now adopt that identity and what the effects are of having adopted that identity. So it's very important for us from a psychological perspective to understand what it is that they're going through and if they're going to be able to psychologically adapt to these new situations and environment that we're going to be placing these individuals in for a period of time. Now, whenever it is that we are going to now parole an individual or that we are going to send them out on probation, we need to have made a decision in terms of their psychological viability for them to be able to reintegrate themselves into society and not commit the criminal acts again in the future prior to them going back into the community. Inmates may also be given psychological assessments during times of psychological crisis that they may be demonstrating high amounts of stress or maladaptation while they are in jail or while they're in prison. And even within death penalty cases where competency might be an issue to be considered prior to execution, is going to be a place where also inmates might potentially be psychologically assessed once again to even see if that may even be a possibility of them getting the death penalty or not. So now that we've talked a little bit about the history of forensic psychology and the basics of what forensic psychology is, what is the future of forensic psychology, or where is it that we're moving towards with forensic psychology? Forensic psychology, even though we saw at the beginning of the 20th century that it was not kind of this growing field within psychology, nowadays forensic psychology is a very popular and fastly growing subfield within psychology. And there's a couple of different reasons why that's happening. Some of those reasons, number one, include that there's lots of different topics associated with mental health that are very important for us, not only at a local level, but also at a federal level, for us trying to provide more mental health support for individuals, not only for individuals who are non-criminals, but also individuals who are now currently going through the criminal justice system. And again, let that be at the juvenile level or even at the adult level. For both men and women, we want to be able to provide them with as much psychological assessment and feedback as we can possibly give them and help to really make sure that these individuals' mental health is what it needs to be, or if it can be adjusted in some particular types of aspects. So since a lot of different issues are now manifesting themselves in terms of mental health, and we have a lot more knowledge about how mental health needs to be addressed and treated. Forensic psychology is growing very much in popularity, especially the clinical forensic psychology portion. Other portions of forensic psychology that are still very important now, the issues of testimonies within courts are very important for us. With a lot more research that we're now doing with present-day research in terms of eyewitness testimony, the influences of stress and emotions, the word usage in terms of a testimony, or by lawyers or whoever the case may be within a court setting, or even while being interviewed, after after a criminal event has occurred. It's going to be very important for us to understand the cognitive aspects associated with the legal systems as well. And also, unfortunately, one of the issues that we do see in our present-day society is that prisons are growing, and prisoner numbers continue to go up and up and up. And that is a big issue for us to also consider as to why it's important for us to have forensic psychology as a subfield. All right, that wraps up our discussion associated with the history of forensic psychology and what forensic psychology is. Next week, we'll be moving on to some other topics that are going to be of great interest to all of us. And you all can follow along with the course calendar to see what it is that we're going to be discussing for for week 3 in our semester. Now, remember that for this week, there are a couple of assignments that need to be completed on Blackboard. Please make sure to go to Blackboard and complete those assignments so that way you do not fall behind in the semester, especially that we're just now beginning the semester. Make sure to have a good rest of your week. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and I will be talking to everyone soon on the discussion boards and also on next week's lecture.